She was a Rockefeller. She married into one of America's richest families, built a palace on the shore of Lake Michigan, and spent a fortune trying to buy Chicago its own opera house. By the time she died in a hotel room in 1932, almost all of it was gone. Her last request wasn't about the money. It was about a wooden trunk, sealed, buried with her, and never opened. What was she hiding? Her name was Edith Rockefeller McCormick, and to understand what happened to her, you have to go back to a kitchen table in Cleveland, Ohio in 1878. Her father, John D. Rockefeller, was teaching his 6-year-old daughter how to divide her allowance into 3 piles: spending, saving, giving. Edith moved the coins with the seriousness of a banker. Then she looked up at him and said something he never forgot. "Father, I will never count pennies when I am grown. I will only count what I give away." He didn't answer her. He just stared. That same week, he had signed the papers that would create Standard Oil. The fortune that would define the rest of the century was coming into existence, and his daughter, without knowing it, had already decided what she would do with her share of it. She grew up strange, by the standards of Gilded Age Cleveland. No finishing school, no balls, Latin, Greek, and German by age 12. And a habit that unsettled her parents, she collected things. Not dolls, relics, Egyptian coins, carved jade, a small Etruscan figurine she carried in her pocket for the next 4 decades. She was building something inside her head long before anyone understood what it was. In 1895, at 23, she married Harold Fowler McCormick, heir to the international harvester fortune. His father had invented the mechanical reaper, the machine that fed 19th century America. It wasn't just a wedding. It was a merger. Combined, in today's money, the 2 families were worth something north of $20 billion. Fewer than 30 people were in the room. 1908, the couple bought 300 acres of lakefront land in Lake Forest, Illinois, and built Villa Churicum. 44 rooms, 15 bathrooms, marble shipped in from Tuscany. A private theatre, formal Italian gardens cascading down to the water. It cost $3 million to build. In today's money, that's roughly $100 million. Edith would live in it for less than a single full summer. By 1950, it was a ruin. By 1956, it was bulldozed. Whatever she thought she was building there, it didn't last the length of one ordinary human lifetime. By 1905, Edith had given birth to 5 children in 10 years. 2 of them would be dead before she turned 35. The first was John, her oldest son, her father's favorite, a boy who could already name animals in 3 languages by age 3. In February 1901, a rash appeared on his neck. Within a day, it had spread to his face. The family doctor said the words every mother in 1901 dreaded: scarlet fever. There was no cure for it. Not for the Rockefellers, not for anyone. The largest private fortune in the country couldn't buy a cure for a strep infection. John died 11 days later, and not quite 4 years old. And here is where the story starts to turn strange. According to her brother's private diary, Edith didn't cry at the funeral. She didn't speak. She reached into the coffin and pressed something into her dead son's mouth. A small turquoise scarab beetle, roughly 3,000 years old, that she'd been carrying in her purse since the previous summer. In ancient Egyptian belief, the scarab was a symbol of rebirth. She wasn't leaving him a keepsake. She was sending him somewhere, and she expected him back. The doctors who attended her that night recorded something in their notes that the family later asked to have removed from the record. The way she kept repeating a single phrase in a voice that didn't sound entirely like her own. Later, her staff would identify the words. She'd said, "He will be Khufu, the pharaoh who built the Great Pyramid." She locked herself in her bedroom for 19 days. When she came out, the staff said she looked 30 years older. She removed every photograph of John from the walls, labeled each one in pencil, and sealed them into a cedar trunk, along with her collection of Egyptian carvings. She would carry that trunk to every house she ever lived in for the next 31 years. Three years later, in 1904, a second child died, an infant daughter named Edith. And this is where the mystery genuinely deepens, because almost nothing about Edith's death was ever made public. The Chicago Tribune gave it one paragraph buried on page 11. The New York Times gave it a single sentence. There was no funeral coverage, no photographs. The death certificate lists the cause as natural causes, infantile, and the line for the attending physician's signature is blank. In an era when 3 doctors would have signed off on the death of a Rockefeller heir, no one signed anything at all. The reason the press stayed silent wasn't an accident. John D. Rockefeller personally called the publishers of every major newspaper east of the Mississippi the morning after Edith died. Nobody said no to him in 1904. What was he protecting? A memo later discovered in the family's papers offers the strangest clue in the entire case. 6 weeks before her death, Edith had been moved out of the family home to an isolated cottage on the estate. What the staff called the quiet house, with 2 nurses and a private doctor. The household manager's memo explaining the move contains one line that has haunted researchers ever since. Mrs. McCormick has expressed concern that the child does not respond to her presence in the manner of the others. Edith stopped speaking for 6 weeks after Edith died. She wore the same black dress for 41 days straight. A maid later testified she counted, and refused to let anyone wash it because it had been near the child. What exactly happened in that cottage has never been fully explained, and the letters Edith wrote about it to her psychiatrist years later remain sealed in a private archive in Zurich to this day. Among American children generally in 1904, roughly 1 in 8 died in infancy. Among the children born into the Rockefeller and McCormick households in those same years, the rate was closer to 2 in 5. Money bought doctors. It didn't buy immunity. There's a photograph from the summer of 1912, taken in the formal garden at Villa Turicum, of Edith standing with her 3 surviving children. Fowler on her right, Muriel on her left, Mathilde at her feet. No one is smiling. And in nearly every photograph taken of that family after 1904, the arrangement is identical. Down to a gap of open space, always in the same spot beside her, where a 5th child would have stood. It took her psychiatrist 12 years to talk her into leaving that empty space out of a family portrait. She had one more child, Mathilde, in 1905, delivered by a midwife in a room filled with white gardenias, with no man but the obstetrician allowed in the house. By then she had survived 5 pregnancies and buried 2 children, and something in her had changed in a way no fortune could repair. For the next 8 years, she threw herself into building a life in Chicago, a $4 million Italian Renaissance villa on Lake Michigan, the city's first opera house, a social world so exacting she had silverware engraved in Florence and tablecloths embroidered by nuns in Belgium. On paper, she had everything. In private, she was reading the Egyptian Book of the Dead, corresponding with occultists in Vienna and Munich, searching for a doorway back to her son. Then, in October 1913, she did something almost no wealthy American woman of her era did. She packed 6 steamer trunks, the cedar trunk that never left her side, $40,000 in gold, and her 3 surviving children, and she sailed for Switzerland. She told her husband it was for a season of rest. She didn't come home for nearly 8 years. She rented a suite at the Hotel Bohr or Lac in Zurich and stayed there for the rest of the decade, enrolling herself as a patient, and eventually a devoted student of a psychiatrist named Carl Jung. What happened inside that analysis is the part of Edith's story that made her, for the rest of her life, a public joke. Starting around 1915, she began telling reporters that Jungian analysis had unlocked detailed memories of her past lives. She had been an Egyptian queen, wife of Tutankhamun. She had been a Babylonian princess. She had been a Renaissance noblewoman in Florence who died giving birth to twins. American newspapers destroyed her for it. One headline called her the most expensive lunatic in modern history. Her father, a deeply religious man, wrote to her brother, "I am ashamed before God of what my daughter has become." Chapter 5. She still didn't come home. And while she sat in Zurich lecturing visitors on Egyptian funerary rites, her husband was 3,000 miles away, beginning an affair that would help finish off both the marriage and a good portion of the McCormick fortune. Her name was Gunnar Wolska, a polished singer with, by every account, one of the least remarkable operatic voices of her generation. Harold spent what would be well over $100 million today trying to manufacture her into a star. Singing lessons, costumes, bribed conductors, an entire opera season personally underwritten just to force her into a lead role. The opening night was a disaster. The audience laughed. He married her anyway. 14 days after his divorce from Edith was finalized in 1921. Edith attended the wedding. She wore black. The divorce settlement itself is its own small mystery. She was entitled, by any reasonable accounting of the two combined fortunes, to a great deal more than she received. Instead, she accepted roughly $5 million, a fraction of what her lawyers advised, and signed the papers, according to the attorneys who handled it, without appearing to read them. 26 years of marriage ended in an afternoon by a woman who no longer seemed to care what the numbers said. If you're keeping track of the pattern here, you've probably already guessed what comes next, because it isn't over. In 1922, back home for the first time in 9 years, Edith's youngest daughter, Mathilde, then 16, took riding lessons in a Swiss alpine village from an instructor named Max Oser. He was 48, 32 years older than her own mother. When their engagement was announced the following year, the press that had once been silenced by Edith's father tore into it without restraint. The heiress who fell for her stable boy, one paper called her. And Edith, the woman who'd spent 8 years searching Zurich for the meaning of her own life, gave the marriage her full and public blessing, and handed her daughter, as a wedding gift, the same turquoise scarab she'd once pressed into her dead son's mouth 22 years earlier. Mathilde would later tell her own daughter that she didn't understand the meaning of that gift until she was an adult. By then, her mother was dead. Her brother John Jr. came from New York against his doctor's orders and sat with her for 3 days. His diary entry from that visit is a single line. She asked me to forgive her. I told her there was nothing to forgive. She did not believe me. Neither did I. She died on August 25th, 1932, 6 days short of her 60th birthday. Her last words, spoken to a nurse who didn't understand the language, were later identified by a scholar as Middle Egyptian. A line from the Book of the Dead, spoken by the dead to keep their own heart from testifying against them at final judgment. O my heart of my mother, do not stand against me as a witness. When a maid packed her room the next morning, she found 3 objects on the bedside table. A photograph of her son John at age 3, a turquoise scarab identical to the one she'd given her daughter, and a handwritten note to her brother, 4 sentences long, which has never been published. According to the estate's own inventory, the final sentence asked that her cedar trunk, the one she had carried for 31 years, be buried with her unopened, and that no one, including her brother, ever be allowed to read what was inside. He honored it. The trunk went into the ground with her in Sleepy Hollow, New York, beside the graves of the 2 children she'd lost. It has never been catalogued. No one alive knows what's inside it. The estate's own paperwork records the note's existence and its length. 4 sentences, and nothing else. Not what it said. Not why it needed to be 4 sentences and no more. Just that it existed, and that her brother, who had sat with her for 3 days at the end, agreed to bury it without ever reading a word. Chapter 8. For decades after her death, that was the whole story. An eccentric heiress, a punchline, a cautionary tale about money and madness. Then, in 1979, the Rockefeller Archive Center received 400 letters Edith had written to Carl Jung, held in private Swiss vault for over half a century. When scholars finally studied them properly, the picture that emerged looked almost nothing like the tabloid version. Jung himself had privately described her, in his case notes, as one of the most psychologically gifted patients of his career. Her reincarnation claims weren't delusions in his framework. They were a grieving woman constructing the only language she had left to survive, burying 2 children before either turned 5. the letters also complicate the version of the Zurich years that made her a punchline. She wasn't lounging in a hotel suite, indulging a rich woman's whim. By her own account and Jung's, she was in analysis most days of the week. For years, working through grief that had no name yet in 1916. The field of trauma psychology, as we understand it today, didn't exist. She was, in effect, inventing her own language for what had happened to her, using the only materials available to an educated woman of her era. Mythology, scripture, the symbolism of the ancient world she'd been collecting since she was a child at that kitchen table in Cleveland. One passage from those letters, written in 1916, may be the truest thing she ever put in writing. I do not believe my children have died. I believe they have hidden themselves in me. And I believe that if I can become quiet enough, I will be able to hear them again. Three of her children outlived her, and none of them escaped what had happened in that family untouched. Her son Fowler spent most of his adult life in seclusion on a Virginia horse farm. Her daughter Muriel lived alone with her mother's Egyptian collection, which she inherited and refused to ever display, and died at 56 after a lifetime of what her doctors called chronic melancholia. Mathilde, widowed at 24 when Max Oser died of a heart attack, never remarried and died at 42, almost exactly the age her mother had been the summer she introduced her to him on that riding trail. Mathilde's own daughter, Anita, gave the only interview any of Edith's descendants ever gave about the family. Decades later, in a small Swiss journal, she said her mother had told her, the night before her own engagement, what Edith had once whispered to her on that alpine trail in 1922. A single question. If you could choose any life, would you choose to be my child again? Mathilde never answered it out loud. She married Max Oser the following spring instead, a man who would never ask anything of her, who would simply let her be quiet. We still don't know what's in that trunk. We don't know exactly what happened in the cottage where Edith had died, or what Edith confessed to her psychiatrist in the letters that remain sealed in Zurich. What we do know is this. A 6-year-old girl once promised her father she would spend her life giving everything away, and by the time she died alone in a hotel room, she kept that promise almost exactly. She just never figured out how to give any of it to the 3 children she still had left. That's the part of Edith Rockefeller McCormick's story nobody tells. Not the Queen of Egypt, not the scandal, not the money. Just a woman who buried her grief in a trunk, asked no one to ever open it, and left the rest of us still wondering what she couldn't bear to say out loud.